Recording in progress.
Yes. Good. Okay. So I think everyone. Robbie doesn't know. We recite these. We recite the four thoughts are very motivational feature, and then we'll pause just to reflect briefly on each one, and then we do the refuge prayer, committing ourselves to following the path rather than relationships and material. Okay. Om Namah Jino Lama Jino Lama Jino Lama. Take care of me, guide me, inspire me, make me one with you. Now I have this unique opportunity, a free and well-favored human form, so difficult to find. But it will not last forever. Death can come at any moment. And wherever I'm born in samsara, there will be suffering. Virtuous or harmful actions, karma's cause and effect cannot be escaped. O Lama, hold me with your compassion so that I may find the path to liberation. And the refuge we recite twice in Tibetan using phonetics, and the sheet in the third time in English. Om Ye Jodang Zoji Jodang Jang Joba Du Dai Janzunji Dagi Gonde Jipe Sonam Ji Drola Benjil Sonje Rumarajo Sonje Jodang Zoji Jodang Jangjo Badu Dani Janzunji Dagi Gonde Jipe Sonamji Drola Benjil Sonje Rumarajo. In the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. Through the virtue generated by this meditation and practice, I achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. Okay. So, just a quick welcome. And I think most of you do know Martin. He's going to be talking to us about the temptations of St. Anthony's, similar but different. Mara.
Thank you. Thanks again for the invitation. Always a pleasure to come to the Kettering group and see everybody, faces old and new, and to join in as well once more and join in with this teaching. And today's title, which is The Three Temptations of Mara, for those who don't know, Mara features in the story of the Buddha, and we'll be taking a look at the story of the Buddha. Certainly his life from birth up until the Enlightenment. And the reason for that is that in my own school, which is the Zen school, which is part of the Northants Buddhist tradition, as is somewhat different to the Southern tradition, We celebrate or commemorate the Buddha's enlightenment today, the 8th of December. In fact, according to the story of the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment, for 7 days and 7 nights. And on the morning of the 8th day, looking up into the clear sky, he saw the morning star, and upon that sensory impact, he awoke and became the Buddha. Buddha is a title, not a name. Buddha means the awakened one, because the Buddha awoke to the truth, and that's what enlightenment is. It's the awakening to, or the realization of seeing reality, seeing things as they really are, which is called Buddha seeing. And this story, which I'd like to sort of look, or at least cover some of the main points tonight, is an archetypal story. And this is something that we often ponder and contemplate during this time. Again, in the temple that I attend in London, we've had a retreat going on since the first. They will have just finished this morning. And it culminates in sitting the night through in commemoration of the fact that the Buddha, according to the story, also sat through every day and every night until he saw into the nexus of reality. Because of that, obviously, the Buddha's story itself is something that we like to go over many times. And sometimes people do groan a little bit, particularly if they've been coming for a few years, because the Buddha's story is very well known. But it's a foundational story. And in the same way as for Christians, the death and resurrection of Christ is the sort of foundational event that makes sense of the whole thing. The Buddha's enlightenment is exactly the same for us. It's also foundational for the whole of the teachings and what became known as Buddhism over the years. So it is a very important story, therefore. And so, as I said, I'd like to sort of begin. I meant to say, the three temptations of Mara obviously feature very much during this time, because Mara, who actually represents one of the deities of the Hindu pantheon. And we have to remember that Hinduism is a parent religion to Buddhism, in the same way that Judaism is a parent religion to Christianity as well. So what the Buddha took several of the teachings that appear in Hinduism, and as it were, gave them a Buddhist twist, a spin, if you like, and made them very particular. But he was always speaking in a way that was very familiar to the people that he was talking with. So things like karma and the wheel of life and so on and so forth, and obviously the practice of meditation as well, feature very heavily in Hinduism as well as in Buddhism. But he changed them slightly. He gave them a subtle twist, as I say. But his story, as such, is something that comes down to us as part of a tradition. And this tradition, it may well be a mixture of history, we don't know. We don't know many facts about, historical facts that is, about the Buddha's life. We know that he did exist. That seems to be pretty settled by now. We know that his father's kingdom, which was the Shakya kingdom, hence his name Shakyamuni, meaning teacher of the Shakyas, the clan or tribe, was resident on the border of what is now modern-day India and Nepal in the northeast, this sort of Himalayan kingdom. And we know that he was indeed a religious teacher. He travelled around mainly eastern India, and he founded what became known as Buddhism. But that's about it. The rest of the story is received. And it's interesting, for myself coming in, I had a Catholic upbringing, and I was used to, obviously, Christianity. And in Christianity, there's a great deal of emphasis on historical truth. The idea that the closer you can get to the actual words of Jesus, the more important that becomes. So history is very important. It's why Christianity is called a revealed religion. But actually, in Buddhism, it's slightly different. There's something even of a certain sort of, I wouldn't say it's casual exactly, but there's not that sort of dependence on historical fact for it, because what matters is the tradition. What matters is the practice, and to verify those teachings, wherever they came from, through one's own practice. As the Buddha said in the Pali Canon, in this fathom-long body, O monks, lies the world, the beginning of the world, the end of the world, and the way that leads to the end of the world. And if you're familiar with the Four Noble Truths, you'll recognize that's a formulation of it. But what the Buddha was pointing at was it's not enough just to learn things. We have to realize those things. And so we always go back to that foundational story that the Buddha himself sat under the tree of enlightenment and realized something, and that we are being called to do the same thing as well in our own bodies, in our own lives as well, in our everyday life. And that practice of meditation, whether it's sitting on a meditation seat, or whether it's meditation in activity, what's sometimes called mindfulness, what my own school tends to call daily life practice, meditation in activity, that really is core. And the teachings are used to measure up our experience against that, against those teachings, so to sort of keep us on the path, so to speak. So what I'd like to do is to take a few of those sort of points raised in the Buddha's life story and examine them in a sort of slightly more archetypal way, and treat the Buddha's life story as an archetypal story. It is a legend, it's a myth, but those mythic elements are not untrue. They are, if you like, perennially true. They're true for all of us. And what I'd like to sort of show is that some of the experiences of the Buddha in his life actually reflect our own very common human experience. Because one of the primary questions that we could ask ourselves is, why do we want to follow the teachings of someone who died 2,500 years ago, halfway around the world, in a culture that's very alien to our own? We now live in a very different world. And externally we do, of course we do. However, the human heart itself hasn't changed. The human heart remains the same. The Buddha talked about suffering and the way out of suffering. And again, as I like to say, if you're ever at a dinner party and someone asks you and says, "Oh, you're a Buddhist, I hear. What exactly did the Buddha teach?" Remember, you've got 10 seconds to tell them, because they're not going to be interested in anything beyond that. So don't start going on about dependent chains of origination or anything, or karma. You've got 10 seconds, and all you need to do is to say, well, what the Buddha taught was suffering and the way out of suffering. And if they want to know any more, they'll ask. Otherwise, you can move on to the next subject, and that's fine. But that question about human suffering, why is it that we suffer? What is happiness, and so forth? How can we live a fulfilled life? These are questions. These are perennial questions that have always existed, and that still very much exist today, east, west, north, and south. And therefore, this is why Buddhism has been able to travel and has successfully transplanted itself around the world. And it's now come west for about 100 years, and it's still early days. It normally takes about 400 years for a religion to become established. It did in China. That's how long it took. So we will see whether it succeeds or not. Time and the Dharma will actually tell. So, looking at the Buddha's life, we can start obviously with the birth, but we have to remember this is Buddhism. In Buddhism, time isn't linear; time is cyclical. Again, this is something else to sort of keep in mind when we approach Buddhism, because like everything, we approach it through the lens of what we already know. But Buddhism does come from another culture. It comes from a very different worldview. And that worldview is something that is only gradually really revealed to us over time. And I would certainly argue, even now amongst Western Buddhists, that a lot of Western Buddhists, I'm quite convinced, don't really appreciate just how radical Buddhism is. We sort of take a lot of things for granted about it, and I think this is why it will probably take 400 years to really put its roots down. But suffice to say that although we talk about the Buddha's birth, actually, of course, there are multiple births. Time is cyclical. Birth and death are not just one event. They are repeated. It reflects what we see in the seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter, then spring again, summer, autumn, winter. Yes, winter repeats, but it's never quite the same. It's so although it is cyclical, that's not to say that quite literally events repeat themselves. They don't, but everything continues on. And when the Buddha himself was asked about the beginning, because these were philosophical topics, how did the world begin? How was it created? And the Buddha dismissed all that sort of thing, and he often just referred to it as beginningless beginning and endless end. This idea that's what he called samsara, the world in which we live, the world of desire, although it's a very layered and complex term, in fact, is just not to worry about how it started. It's not relevant to us. The fact is we're in it. The fact is we are in the process of either being born, growing, decaying, or dying, and then being reborn again. And of course, the same is true of the Buddha. And this is reflected in a series of stories called the Jataka tales. Jataka means the birth stories. And these are the previous births of the Buddha. And these came many, many years, centuries after the Buddha. Obviously, no one pretends that they're the actual pre-stories. But they show how the great being who would become the Buddha, who would become Gautama, first Prince Gautama and then the Buddha, how he developed the virtues, things like patience and compassion and wisdom, over many, many lifetimes. And these stories are often used like teaching stories. They're often used as children's stories as well nowadays. But it still gives that sense that actually we're landing into this story, not at the beginning, but at a certain a waymarking place, so to speak. And that place is, of course, the last incarnation of the Buddha. And so this is important for us as well to remember that, in fact, however we come in to Buddhism, this is not the beginning. It's just, so to speak, another chapter that's opening up that we're living through. And why is it that we're here? Why is it that we came here? No doubt we all have a reason that we think we know why we're here. But quite often we find over time that reason changes. And I was always quite impressed. I used to go to the Buddhist Society summer school, and we would have a lot of new people would come along to Buddhism, all Westerners, virtually all, 98% Westerners. People would come and they would hear the talk. And it's quite an intense week. A lot of talks, a lot of very good quality talks. And people would, by the end of the week, would be a little bit sort of emotionally high, as you are at these sort of things. But many of them would often say, when I first heard my first talk about Buddhism, I read my first book, something really just clicked. It was as if I'd come home. And that always really struck me as a very odd thing. How can you come home to something, that you've never had experienced before? And this is, again, something that's understood in Buddhism as well, in its understanding of consciousness or its understanding of the heart, the human heart, what's sometimes called mind. It's actually a translation of the Sanskrit term chitta, but further sort of term heart, you could say psyche even. And that is that only a part of that is personal, that we are attached to something far deeper as well, which makes sense because obviously if we've been reborn many, many times, then what is it that's actually being reborn? It's not a self as such, but there's something that's moving through, I remember my own teacher, shortly before she died, said to me, Martin, she said, forms come and go, but in the end, it's just life that goes on. But what she meant by that life is life with a capital L, not the little life that I have, but this life in the greatest sense of things, of which we are all an interconnected part. And this is the vision, if you like. This is the cosmology of Buddhism. So, yes, we're beginning our story with the birth of the Buddha, but again, keeping everything that I've said in mind. So the story goes that his mother, Queen Maya, had a dream, and in that dream, a white elephant approached her and entered into her left side. And when she woke up in the morning, she had this sense that it was a portent of something. And when it was discovered that she was pregnant, shortly afterwards, then the two things came together and they realised that this was a portentous birth. And this idea of the sort of spiritual birth, so to speak, this sort of the births of some great being or some great hero appears again and again in all myths. If you think Christ had the virgin birth, and we have, if you look into sort of Greek myths as well, often there's earthquakes and great signs in the sky and all this sort of stuff. It's very normal for that sort of thing. This is a motif that's known in folklore as the miraculous birth. And the American mythologist Joseph Campbell said, of course, we have to treat these things with care. We know that really that what's being referenced here is not a physical thing, not a physical birth. It's actually a spiritual one. And this is important to actually understand, because this story that I'm telling you is not a story that belongs to somebody else. It's a story that belongs to you and me. What this is a birth of, and this is the point that Campbell goes on to make, is the birth of a spiritual consciousness in the human being. And what he meant by this was that this capacity in humans to be able to reflect what's known as sati, what's often translated as mindfulness, is a capacity in human consciousness that we all have, but it doesn't just develop naturally. It has to be trained in. So unlike the physical form, if you're born as a baby, you're looked after, and as long as you look after the baby, you feed it, you do all the things you're supposed to do with the baby, the physical form will grow quite naturally. You don't have to do anything special. It will just happen. But inwardly, and in the sort of realm of the psyche, it's not the same. The elements of the psyche itself have to be trained in order to bring them into their full capacity. And when it comes to sati, this ability to reflect and to be able to see things as they really are, this is something that also has to be trained in as well. And it's interesting because when Queen Maya gave birth, finally it's said that she was on her way, which was common at that time. The mother-to-be would leave her husband's house and would return to her own parents' house, and she'd give birth there. And she was on the way to her mother's house when she was caught short in a place called the Lumpini Gardens. And you can see pictures of it as well in sort of Buddhist iconography. There, clutching onto a tree, the infant Buddha emerged from her right side. So remember, the elephant goes in through the left, and out comes the baby Buddha on the right side. And it's said at that point that the baby Buddha took 7 steps in each of the 4 cardinal points, raised one hand to heaven, one into the earth, and declared, between heaven and earth, I alone am the world honoured one. So immediately this isn't something that happens in maternity wards up and down the country or anywhere. So we know that we're seeing something mythic in this point. So what is this between heaven and earth, I am the world honoured one? Well, remember that and what are those 4 steps as well? What are those 7 steps in the 4 direct cardinal points? Well, actually, this is a consciousness. This consciousness is a consciousness that can go anywhere. And by contrast, what is being shown here is that in a human being, quite often that doesn't develop this sati, then we become subject to our own desire. We like to think that we're in charge of ourselves, in charge of our destiny. But actually, if we are driven by our own wants and our own fears, then many parts of the world become blocked off from us. And what this baby is really showing is, so to speak, a newly emerged spiritual consciousness that is quite open. It hasn't been conditioned. There's no conditioning to it yet. It hasn't learned to be frightened of anything. It hasn't learned to develop desires. It hasn't learned to develop self-beliefs, such as, for example, I'll give a good example. Again, those of you who've been coming a few times will know I don't tell any new stories. It's the same old ones, but I think they make the point. Many years ago, I used to give a Sunday talk at the Buddhist Society, for people who would come into London from out of town. And there was a sort of elderly lady who would come every month, and she always came to the talk. Very sweet, very lovely. And I gave this talk to her on that particular day about how our practice was to give ourselves away wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. And that in doing that, in this laying down of myself, there is a joining up then with the circumstance, with the situation, and that we find not only liberation in that moment, but also the vitality that we also, often secretly, really crave. And she came down afterwards and said, oh, you know, this teaching that the Buddha gave about this being able to lay myself down makes total sense to me, absolutely total sense, and how it liberates the heart. She said, but the problem is that I don't have enough self to lay down. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I always think that I can't. I always lack, that sort of self-esteem. I always feel that it'll all be too much. I don't have the confidence to do this. So actually, what I really need to do is to develop that confidence, develop that self-esteem, and then I can lay it down, as the Buddha said. So I said to her, but who is it that tells you that you can't? Who is it that tells you that you lack the confidence? Who is it that tells you that you'll be overwhelmed if you take on this great thing or whatever it is? I said, that's the self that needs to be laid down, because that's where all the power is. That's where all the energy is. It is totally convincing to you, and you obey it. This God Almighty complex that I am. And she looked at me, and in that instant, the sweet little old lady vanished, and there was something very cold and steely looking out of her eyes. And she said, but I am rubbish. Don't argue with that. But that's where her strength was. All that strength now had gone into those self-beliefs that she had now become, that she now wore very close to her. And we all have those. I need my 2 cups of coffee in the morning, otherwise I just can't cope with life. And we all encounter these things. This is why when you go on retreats, for example, you really begin to meet those things. And what are these things? These are the things that that restrict us. These are the things that rule my life, that say, well, unless I can have my 8 hours sleep every night, I can't function. And then life comes along and takes away those 8 hours sleep. What happens then? What are you going to do? What happens? You're going to fall apart? Or do you actually discover that there's a strength there that allows us to continue? And then suddenly we've crossed over from that self-belief, and it begins to fall down a little bit. All those little things that begin to come up. And these are the things that over time have to be explored, and one by one they have to be let go of. So the way to that is to become aware of them. And that awareness is what's called sati. And that's why we develop sati. That's why in our practice of meditation or daily life practice, mindfulness if you like, we are developing sati to become aware of these little things, of these self-beliefs, if you like, what the Buddha called the attachment ultimately to myself, because they all come back to me. It's rather like, for example, people often complain that during meditation, all this thinking sort of going on, and they can't sort of seem to quieten it down or whatever. And I say, well, if it's there, then just take a look at it. What's it about, actually? And if we look at what all that self-talk is about, whether it's on the cushion or when we're walking down the street or whatever, it's all about me. It's what I think, what I want, whether I agree with it, how does it affect me, what do I think of it, do I think it's right or wrong? Or it's always somewhere in the center of that, there's something about me, nearly always with that. We're obsessed. This is what the Buddha talked about when he talked about the attachments in the Four Noble Truths. We are attached to this notion of myself. So when this baby took a step in the 4 directions, basically he was showing that he can go anywhere. He's not frightened. He's not frightened of going to a place where he's not going to get 8 hours sleep. He's not frightened of not having those 2 cups of coffee in the morning. Put in whatever is your own particular thing. He's free to go anywhere, because once we give ourselves into that self-belief, then that place becomes blocked off to us. We can no longer go into that place because it's too frightening for us. And so we desire to go somewhere where I feel safe, or somewhere where, I can feel that I can be myself. So, hence, between heaven and earth, I alone am the world honoured one. Because that is the consciousness of liberation. This is why sati is cultivated. And so, obviously, he was taken back to the palace, and as was usual at that time, there was a sage who prognosticated what the future destiny of this child would be. And the result was that either he would become a great king, like his father, or he would become a great religious teacher. And his father decided, being the king, that he wanted the best for his son, which is obviously to be a king like his father. And so he took steps to ensure that his son would never be tempted to go down the religious path. Now, there's a couple of interesting things at this particular juncture. First of all, that we see in Buddhism that our lives are not fated. That is, that they're not set in stone. Yet neither are they totally arbitrary either. There isn't a blank slate as such. There are a range of possibilities that we are always constrained by circumstances. We're always constrained by the times in which we live. There's a classic formulation about how a person comes to Buddhism and how they start upon the path. It's said that to begin with, you have to be born into a human body. Then you have to be born at a time when the Buddha Dharma is available. Again, in that vast edifice of cyclical time, the existence of the Buddha Dharma, the Buddha's teachings, only happens very occasionally. And there are vast spaces in between when there is no Buddha Dharma. So you have to be born at a time when it's available. Thirdly, you have to be born in a place where it's available, because 500 years ago, if you were born in Europe, Buddhism certainly existed in the world, but if you were living in Germany or the UK or somewhere, you would not come into contact with it. And then fourth, having come into contact with it, because you're in a human body at a time and at a place where it's available, coming into contact with it, not everybody's heart inclines towards it. So your heart then has to be moved and be inclined towards it in order to do that. So those four things have to come together. Those four things create the situation. And if they're not there, then becoming a Buddhist or following the Buddhist teachings simply will not happen. So we are always within these circumstances, and there are always things sort of playing on us as well. And so we do have a destiny, but we can create a destiny within those circumstances. And so there's a sort of middle, again, there's a sort of middle way there. So, as I said, he was proffered the destiny either of becoming a great king like his father, or a great religious teacher. And of course, this is the other interesting thing then. Obviously, as a child, we are dependent on someone to look after us and to raise us. And obviously, they're making decisions for us as well, just as the king made a decision for his son. And it's done out of love. It's done because the father wants the best for his son. But the problem is, he sees his son's life in his own terms. For the king, in his own imagination and in his own understanding, the best is to be a king like himself. And that's therefore what he wants for his son. But nature is something different, and karma is something different as well. And as we see from this story, actually circumstances almost conspire to thwart the king, and indeed they do. Suffice to say that that what his father did, his father realized that the religious life often comes to those who become disappointed in the world. If you lose faith in the world, then it's quite normal then to begin to question it. And to begin to question the world is to begin to step back from it, and to begin, as it were, to take perhaps a different view, to see if there's something behind the world of appearances. That's quite a common thing. As we will see, usually there's some kind of disappointment that's necessary to realize that in fact there may be an alternative. Because how do we normally try and satisfy ourselves? We try and normally satisfy ourselves by satisfying our desires. If a desire comes up and we can satisfy it, it's fine. It's great. It works. You know, you're happy for a little bit, and then a desire arises again. But if you can satisfy it, well, then you can do that too. But what happens when you can't? What happens when something that you really love is taken away? What happens when something that you depend on for your happiness falls down or no longer functions anymore? I remember once reading, this was back in the, I think maybe in the late 70s or early 80s, there was a young man who had been sort of spotted for a Premier League football club, and all he ever wanted to do was to play football. And he was taken and put into the school, and he would train, and he was really excited. And then he was in a car accident, lost his foot. He was 18. And when he was interviewed, he said, well, life is now over for me. Fortunately, it wasn't. Life is bigger than my idea and my ambition, thank goodness. Otherwise, his life really would have been over. But this is the point here. That life is, although we call it my life, actually life is its own thing. Life has its own qualities. Life has its own agency. I am merely, so to speak, the tail and not the dog. And it's the dog that wags the tail, not the tail the dog either, which is just as well. Because life has to, as it were, be able to supersede and go beyond what I can imagine for myself. And so the father literally imprisoned the boy in his palace. It was a gilded cage, obviously. He was given everything. He was given a great education. He had everything that he needed, and he married young, and he had a son as well. But there was something dissatisfactory. There was something that wasn't satisfied in himself. And this disturbance, which has a name in Buddhism, is called dukkha. And dukkha is translated as suffering, but actually it means a sense of being disturbed, a sense of dissatisfactoriness, that somehow, no matter what happens, there's something just not quite fulfilling about it. And this was later to be one of the insights, or the major insights, if you like, that the Buddha had, because the Buddha wanted to know what the cause of human suffering was. And he's called it dukkha, this suffering. He said and that this suffering is something that is always in us and can never be satisfied by the world. And I remember, again, a well-oiled story that I had. I remember back in the early 90s, it was a Saturday, and I went to, this is in the day before streaming services, when you had DVDs, and on a Saturday I used to go to Blockbusters, which was the DVD video place, and so did everybody else at 6 o'clock on a Saturday. And you'd pick something and you'd stand in the queue, waiting to rent your DVD. And as you queued to go to the kiosk, there were all these sweet racks by the side, so that parents with small children would have to, as it were, rein them in. And of course the children could see all these bags of sweets around, and actually that was the idea. And at one point I was in the queue, and there was a sweet rack just to my side, and this little girl sort of popped out from behind and said, "Daddy, Daddy, look at this, it's really interesting." And Daddy, who was standing in front of me, sort of looked and said, no, come back to the queue, come back to the queue. And she disappeared again, and 2 minutes, a minute later, she walked back out with this big family-sized pack of Maltesers. And she said, "Guess what, Daddy? These are my absolute favourite." And Daddy said, "You've got sweets at home, come back to the queue, we're going to be served." And she looked at him, really with a look that only a small child can, and said, "But Daddy, if you buy me these, I promise you, I will never ask you for anything again." And of course, as I say, only a child can really get away with saying something like that. But children articulate exactly what they feel. And if we've ever experienced a powerful desire, that is exactly what any desire feels like. If only I can have this fulfilled, I will never need to ask for anything again. As long as a desire remains unfulfilled, it contains within it the possibility of fulfillment. And that fulfillment is compelling. That's what draws us along. Of course, what would happen, and I cannot remember whether that girl got that bag of sweets or not, but let's say she did. Of course, Daddy's the best daddy in the whole world, and off they go. And half an hour later, she's arguing with her brother over the remote control about what they're going to watch on TV. Let's say she didn't get that bag of Maltesers. That is cruel and uncaring, and perhaps there's a few tears. And half an hour later, she's arguing with her brother over the remote control about what they're going to watch on TV. In other words, it makes little difference whether you get it or you don't. You end up back in the same place sooner or later. And that was the insight of the Buddha. He recognized that it didn't really matter whether you get what you want or you don't get what you want, to a degree. Because after that, something else will happen that will cause us to want something more. And that is a continual process. And that disturbance of the heart is what he refers to as dukkha. So dukkha isn't just a one-off event. It's a continual, this sense of dissatisfaction that arises and passes away, arises and passes away. And I remember actually at another summer school, the late Trevor Leggett, who was pivotal, he was a pioneer in bringing judo to this country. And he began some of the very first judo clubs in this country. He was asked by a member of the audience who was trying to give up smoking. And Trevor's reply, his sort of how to stop smoking advice was very simple. Don't try and stop. Don't set your mind to thinking that you're going to stop. He said, but make a deal with yourself. He said, when you feel the craving to have a cigarette, he said, just look at your watch and wait for 2 minutes. If at the end of that 2 minutes, ask yourself again, do I still want a cigarette? If you do, have one. But if you don't, then just continue. He's thinking about it when he was asked to explain why he said that. He said most of these cravings are very short. They're like straw fires. They're intense at the time, but if you sit them out, they go because they're impermanent. They don't actually last very long. And over time, you build up a new habit. And that's how, and it's the new habit that will then supersede the old one. He said that is how you bring about that change from one habit to another. And of course, he'd been practicing for a long time, so he knew how these things worked. Anyway, the pivotal moment comes when the Buddha, who is now a young man, decided that he would venture outside the palace, which is something that his father had forbidden him to do. But in the end, the father relented, but he tried to make sure that his son didn't see anything disturbing on those trips out. He took 4 trips out, and it's said that the gods conspired to show him what he needed to be shown in order to change the course of his life. And on those first 3 trips out, he saw an old man, then he saw a sick man, and on the third, he saw a corpse, he saw a funeral procession. And each time he had to ask his charioteer what these things were, and the charioteer had to explain them to him, what sickness was, what old age was, what death was. Now, this seems odd because he was well educated, and he was also well educated in the literature of his day, so he would have known about these things because he's reading poetry and literature. They all write about, loss and death and old age and all this sort of mortality. It's a very common subject. So he knew about it, but he'd never witnessed it. He'd never actually seen it. And Channa was able to explain to him that this was going to happen to him, and it would also happen to everybody that he loved as well. And this produced what we would call a trauma in sort of modern psychological parlance. But basically, it completely turned upside down the world in which he lived. And this is a really important part now, because sooner or later, all of us experience loss. All of us will experience the experience of the little world that we inhabit being turned upside down. I remember being on the London Underground many years ago, and someone was wearing a badge, and it just said, "Why not you?" And I thought, actually, yeah, that's absolutely true, because isn't it? It's a refrain when something happens. Oh, why is it always me that sort of, I get stuck in traffic when I'm, in a hurry? Well, why not you? It's not as if you don't know about these things. It's not as if you don't watch the news or you don't hear people telling you that these things happen to them as well. So why not you? But it does. It comes as an affront, actually, when it really happens to us. But it also makes us very afraid as well, because it makes us realize that we live in a world that is, even if it appears to be certain, isn't. And that carpet can be taken away from us at any time. And that also is known to, that also is dukkha as well, this uncertainty. And so everything that he had really experienced suddenly fell apart. And this, even though he went back to the palace, we have to understand that he wasn't re-entering the same palace that he left anymore, because he'd learned something. He realized there was something false about this. It was an appearance of something that wasn't true. His father had tried to hide the truth from him, the truth of the world, that is, the truth of dukkha. But you can't forever. If you decide to take on reality, you can do it for a little bit, but then you're going to lose. It's a battle in the end you cannot win. And that's also an important part of this story too. So he then took a fourth trip out. And on that fourth trip, he saw a mendicant, basically, one of the many, many wandering holy men. And this holy man was sitting in meditation by the side of the road with a serene look on his face. The Prince Gautama, couldn't believe it, because as far as he was concerned, the whole world was on fire. There was nothing redeemable about the world. And so he stopped his chariot and he said to the mendicant, he said, "How can you sit here like this and so calmly?" And the mendicant replied, "Because I search for the deathless." And after some reflection, Prince Gautama decided that he too must search for the deathless too. And what really motivated him was that he wanted to find a cure for this suffering. Why is it that human beings suffering? If you could find that, if you could bring it back, then not only would he benefit, but also he would be able to bring it back for humanity. So even from the beginning, there was this seed of compassion for all humanity. So the story goes that he sort of snuck out in the middle of the night, he changed clothes with a beggar, and he began his spiritual journey. The one thing that his father didn't want to happen had now happened. And what's so interesting about this is that if he had been brought up with death from the beginning, as everybody was in India, death was all around you, and so old age and sickness was all around you, he would never have had that experience. So in fact, his father's decision actually helped that happen. So, which is interesting. The other thing as well, just to point out as well, of those 4 trips, the first 3 turned the world upside down. The 4th one showed the way. And that's also, again, part of this story, because there is so to speak, we need to be a little bit careful about this, but there is this aspect of what's called the Dharma. Now, I'm sure many of you know, Buddhism in itself has no creator God in it. But that's not to say there isn't a spiritual power. There is, and the spiritual power is called the Dharma. It is, if you like, the inherent, in Mahayana, this is synonymous with the nature of things. So we talk about nature a lot. And that we are part of that nature as well. And that nature, not only are we part of it, but we also are guided by it as well. And part of the realization, part of the Buddha's realization, is to realize the nature of things and to go in accord with them as well. So we get this sense in the story that there's something going on, something bigger than just the individual, his decisions, the decisions that Prince Gautama took, that as it were, he was being led, and that this is a force in our lives, in our own life too. And so he began his spiritual journey. And to begin with, he went to 2 great teachers because he had to learn spiritual practices, he had to learn how to meditate, etc. Interesting that he didn't just go off and do his own thing. He didn't just make it up as he went along. He actually went to the existing traditions, because the traditions are seen as the repository of the collective wisdom over the years. We often see tradition now as something to be, skeptical of, but that's that's only been in existence for the past 300 years in our part of the world. Before then, tradition was seen as the collective wisdom of the tribe or the community or the civilization. And so one explored them, even if you were going to innovate on it. First of all, you have to go into it and learn it thoroughly, and then you can take it from there. Then you reinterpret it according to the contemporary life and so forth. Anyway, so he went to the two teachers. He was excelled at his spiritual practices, and as a result, he was offered the lineage for both of them, and he rejected them both times. Why? Because in all his meditation practices and all his spiritual practices, it was never revealed to him what the cause of human suffering was. He attained great levels of consciousness, but the actual cause of human suffering was never answered, and he remained true to that. Because he could have just had a spiritual career, and you can become a great religious teacher, have lots of people around you, you'll be fed and watered, and you do some teaching, and it's not a bad life. It's a career like any other. But he knew what his calling was, and that's again the important thing, over a period to begin to clarify what really is important. And I remember, as I said, I lived in a temple for a number of years, and every so often someone would come, rather like the Buddha, who'd suffered a disappointment, and they didn't know what to do with themselves. And the temptation often was with them, they'd say, oh, well, I'll go off and travel or do something like that. And we would say, well, why don't you just come in and live in the temple for 6 months? Just come live in the temple for 6 months. And if they'd done a certain amount of training, they would understand. Because when you go into a place like that, what happens is that bit by bit, your choices are taken away from you. And as your choices are taken away from you, because when you live in a monastic environment, you can't decide when you're going to eat, you can't watch TV, you don't have a phone, you have to just do as you're told until you're told to stop, and then you do the next thing. You follow a timetable and so forth. And sooner or later, those things, to begin with, it's all a bit novel, but after a while, you don't want to do those things anymore. And so you then have to face your own not wanting. And there's a sort of struggle between your aspiration to be there and to follow the path that is unfolding with you, but also in the moment, the desire to have things your own way. And it constellates that, it precipitates that. And so you have to learn to be able to contain your own desires. And as you do that, what happens is you get stripped away. And as you get stripped away, all those things that you think you can't do without, like the 2 cups of coffee and all this sort of thing, you discover you can do without them. And you can do without the sleep. And you can do without not being able to watch your favourite TV series. And you can do without playing the video game. You can actually do an awful lot, though you think you can't. That's what's being taken away from you. But eventually you come down to 1 or 2 things that are really important. And that's, so to speak, that then gives you the orientation that you know then what it is that's important. And you are no longer distracted by those other things. You end up with that sort of focus and constancy, and you can then see your path going forward. It becomes much clearer. Vocation, if you like. And so it was as well with him. And after he had left those 2 teachers, he then decided that he did have to go out on his own to really, because no one else had seemed to be able to answer that question for him. And this is when he went into that very sort of strict privation. He became a very severe ascetic. And in that asceticism, which is quite common at the time, there's a lot of mortification of the flesh. You don't eat, you go around naked, you don't wash, and all that sort of thing. He, so severe and so good was he at this, that 5 like-minded ascetics looked up to him as their guru. And it got to the point when he realized that if he carried on in this way, he was going to die. And although he wasn't afraid of death, he realized that he was going to die without having answered his question, and that was pointless. And so he made the decision to give up the ascetic's life, and he took some rice gruel from a passing devotee and took a wash in the river, two things that an ascetic obviously doesn't do. And when the 5 ascetics saw him doing this, they said, look, the ascetic got him, he's taken to a life of luxury, and they abandoned him as well. So now we have this point, and this is really the pivotal point, because we're coming to the point where he sits under the Bodhi tree. Because now everything that he was born with, he has walked away from. Everything that he had forged, his own spiritual career, including those 5 ascetics, have now abandoned him as well. He was thoroughly without everything. He was empty. He was completely empty. And it was at that point that he then conceived the great vow to sit under the Bodhi tree, to either see into the nexus of human suffering or to die in the attempt. And that's also important as well, because, we can all make vows, but it really relies on one's inner state as to how powerful that vow is going to be. We did the 4 thoughts at the beginning of this talk, and Bob mentioned about how they're motivational. And they are, over a period of time, through recitation, through repetition, we can begin to forge something. But there comes a point when all of that has to become a concatenation, all of that has to come together. And for him, it was when he sat down under the Bodhi tree. There's an old folk tale. It's not part of the scriptures as such, but it's said that when Mara, who is the god of samsara, he's an inheritance from the Hindu pantheon. When Mara was first given rulership over samsara, he heard a prophecy that under the Bodhi tree one day a Buddha would appear. And if a Buddha appears, the Buddha shows the way out of samsara. And no god wants his kingdom depopulated, so he's very keen for Buddhas not to arise. And so he set one of his demons, called Red Eye, to sit vigil by the tree, and told him that if he sees someone come to sit under the tree who really looked like he was serious, to immediately come and tell Mara. And for aeons, nothing happened. And then one day, Mara's court doors are flung open, and in rushes Red Eye to say, I've seen him. He said, all these times, for many, many years, I've seen many people come and sit under the Bodhi tree, but they were not serious, and I knew they were not serious. But this one is different. I've seen a man approach the Bodhi tree and sit down, and from the look in his eye, anything he sets his mind to, he will attain. And that is the difference. When for somebody who has nothing to lose, then they really are at that point when anything they really set their mind to, they probably will attain or die in the attempt. And so at that point then, of course, Mara, with his whole entourage, rushes to the Bodhi tree, and there they find the ascetic Gautama sitting under the tree. And so we come to the 3 temptations, finally. And the 3 temptations of Mara were, first of all, that Mara tempted the great being with his sense of status and with his sense of duty. What he said to him was this. He said, what are you doing? You've proved to everybody that you are a great sage. Everybody knows that. But don't forget, you are your father's son. You are a prince. He needs a king. You have a wife. She needs a husband. You have a son. He needs a father. What are you doing? Leave. But he didn't. He carried on staying. But this is an important temptation, because we have to remember that actually this is that rational voice that comes in. But what often appears reasonable to me often isn't. There is something very powerful, very passionate, very irrational actually underneath it. And we have to remember that human beings are the product of about 4 billion years of evolution, and the development of this sort of rationale, what we call rationality, is the most recent development. Most of it is not. And it's not uncommon at all for our own reasoning to be able to present us with all sorts of arguments that just happen to align with, in fact, the things that make me feel safe, or make me feel wanted, or make me feel important, and so forth. Just happen to do that. Because the passions themselves can hijack reason, as we can see. I can convince myself of pretty much anything if I'm really desperate enough to actually do that. And this is something to be aware of. And this is how Mara approached him first of all. So that was the top layer. Then it goes down to the next layer. Mara then sent his daughters, and his daughters represent desire itself. They are desire itself. And they also tried to lure the ascetic from the seat under what's called the immovable spot underneath the Bodhi tree. But they also failed. Again, the heart was completely empty. They could find no grip on it. Now, why is that? Well, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that desire arises in the first place? And these three temptations, of course, if you look at them, you can see that they correspond with what's known as the three fires, sometimes called the three poisons, what's known as the three pleasures. They appear on the wheel of life. They are greed, hatred or aversion is better, and then delusion, the delusion of a separate self. And scripturally, it's always said that both greed and aversion, whether it's hatred or fear, always arise in the presence of delusion. Why? Because delusion is the delusion that there is a separateness between me and everything else. That feeling of self-consciousness is a feeling of separation from everything around me. That inner commentator, that inner video, is, as it were, rather like a sports commentator. There's the on the pitch, there is the sport going on. That's where all the action is. But the sports commentator sits up to one side, doesn't participate in it, but comments and judges and passes opinion on what is actually happening. So there is this sense of separateness, what we call self-consciousness. Imagine, you go to a party and the only person you know is the host. And the host is flitting around, entertaining everybody. So you don't know anybody. You're a little bit shy. You're a little bit nervous. You don't know anybody. Should you go and join into a conversation? Will people think you're being a bit pushy? Maybe you should just stand to one side. But people will think maybe you're a bit aloof. I don't want to appear aloof at a party. So what should I do? Should I go or should I stay? Should I sit down or stand up? There's a chair there. Well, maybe somebody else will want to sit there. And if I sit down, it'll be a bit embarrassing. And then I have to stand up and move. These are the things, that feeling of overbearing self-consciousness, that feeling that somehow I cannot engage with or participate in the situation. This is exactly what we call self-consciousness. But there's always some self-consciousness going on when we're, in Sainsbury's or when we're, walking down the street or something like that. In fact, I'm constantly looking for something to distract myself with a lot of the time, even if it's just commenting about what I'm doing. There's this feeling of just being slightly apart. And that is an appearance. The Buddha said this is, if you like, a false consciousness. That actually, in the absence of that self-consciousness, there is what's called samadhi, which is a joined up. Samadhi simply translates as oneness, being at one with what at this moment is being done, which just happens to be our practice. In the practice of meditation, we become the breath. In the practice of walking down the street, we become walking down the street. Whatever we're doing, we become at one with it. We give ourselves wholeheartedly into it, participate with it, and roll with it. In one of the Mahayana Sutras, it says the heart rolls with the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things is just the Chinese way of talking about events and phenomena. This rolling is truly mysterious. The heart rolls with the 10,000 things. This rolling is truly mysterious. And so, with that, then, in that empty heart, when the heart is truly empty, there's nothing there anymore, desire has no role to play. Because in order for desire to arise, there has to be a feeling of separation. There has to be a feeling of a lack in here, and something out there that I want to pull into myself. Hatred or fear is the reverse of that. It's the expulsion or driving away out of myself or out of my aura, so to speak, of something that is disliked or feared. So there has to be that separation for desire and fear to exist. In the absence of that feeling of a separation, in the absence of that delusion of the separation, then desire and fear do not arise. There is just the rolling with the 10,000 things. And of course, people then often come around and say, well, wait a minute, without desire or without, aversion, then there would be no motivation to do anything. But this is not true at all. Actually, here we are in a universe that's 13.5 billion years old, according to the latest from astrophysics. And look at what it's done. And yet there's no desire in it whatsoever. Things unfold according to that nature, according to that life. Remember what I said before, my own teacher, when she said, forms come and go, but life goes on. There is already an impetus in life, and that impetus flows through us as well. And this is something that's quite different to my desires or my fears and my not wanting, etc. So with that, then, the daughters of Mara withdrew. And finally, Mara sent his sons, these are the great demons. And these represent fear. And they threw their spears at the great being, but those spears turned into flowers and rained down on him. And they obviously had no input into him either. And so at the end, they withdrew as well. So, but what we have here is this layered response. And this is something that we actually encounter. So, for example, if we're at a session or if we're in a meditation, that rational voice comes in. And then if we ignore it, then a powerful desire or fascination will suddenly arise. I remember being at retreats once, and we were told, because when you're on retreat, you don't talk, and neither do you read anything either. And we used